We can't get food to our guests without preparing it, right? Food preparation is a huge part of just about every restaurant and food service operation, and at every point in the flow of food, we need to be super careful. As a manager, there's a lot to know in order to keep food safe, and you need to make sure your staff members do the right things too. We're going to start out with preparation basics, including safe thawing practices. Then we're going to move on to what you need to know in order to prep specific food. After that, we'll cover safe cooking, cooling, and reheating. Pretty standard stuff, right? The problem is that even a small mistake during preparation can have a huge impact. Take a look at this.
A 73-year-old woman died, and 51 people were hospitalized after eating undercooked turkey meatballs at a buffet in the southeastern United States. Every one of the victims suffered illness caused by salmonella, and an investigation was launched to determine the cause. Investigators from the local regulatory authority, along with outside experts, determined what had gone wrong. Apparently, the chef at the operation had browned the outside of the meatballs, but failed to finish baking them. This left the centers of the meatballs undercooked.
See what I mean? It was just a simple mistake, but look what happened. Pathogens have the potential to spread and grow during preparation. That's why it's your job to understand all of this stuff and make sure your staff does too. Different operations will have different food prep challenges, but there are some basics that we all need to understand.
Take a look at these two pictures. Which one shows food being prepped safely? That's right. This prep station has been correctly cleaned and sanitized. But the prep station in the other photo? Well, that one clearly wasn't. This is a really basic task that you need to share with your staff. Make sure equipment is correctly cleaned and sanitized, including workstations, cutting boards, and utensils. Here's another one. Which photo shows food being prepped safely? Yep, this food is safer because the person has pulled a smaller amount of tuna salad from the cooler. Only remove as much food from the cooler as you can prep in a short period of time. You should never prep TCS food in large batches, as the person is doing in the other picture, because it's sitting at room temperature and that can be unsafe. Small batches keep ingredients from sitting out for long periods of time. And when you're done, return prep food to coolers as quickly as possible.
Let's switch gears to something that usually gets a bit less attention than time and temperature control, but is still important: additives and honest presentation. If you use additives in your operation, there are some basic guidelines to follow. First, only use additives that are approved by your local regulatory authority and never use more than is allowed by law. Also, never use additives to alter the appearance of food. Sulfites are one additive to be particularly aware of. Don't sell produce that was treated with sulfites before it was received in the operation. Plus, you shouldn't add any sulfites to produce that will be eaten raw. And that pretty much covers additives. Now, everyone wants to make sure the food looks delicious, but it's important to remember that there are some rules to follow. Food has to be presented to guests in a way that won't mislead or misinform them. Guests need to be able to judge the true appearance, color, and quality of food. That means it's important to never misrepresent the appearance of food by using food additives or food coloring, or by using colored overwraps or lights. When it comes to honest presentation, this last one should be obvious. The food needs to be presented to guests as what it actually is. So, for example, if the menu says a dish contains Atlantic cod, then it must be made with Atlantic cod and not some other fish. Now, whether it's due to food coloring or whatever, if you find food in your operation that hasn't been honestly presented, go ahead and throw it out. Speaking of throwing food out, you should toss any food that has become unsafe unless it can be reconditioned. Reconditioning basically means restoring food to a safe condition. Let me give you an example. If you had hot food, let's say beef stew, and it was held in the temperature danger zone for less than 2 hours, then you could recondition the stew by reheating it. This would return the food to a safe condition. Not everything can be reconditioned, though. And you have to be particularly careful with ready-to-eat food. For example, if you find food that has been handled by staff who were restricted or excluded from the operation due to illness, throw it out. Also, toss any food that is contaminated by hands or by bodily fluids from the nose or mouth. And finally, if food has exceeded the time and temperature requirements designed to keep food safe, toss it.
Okay, let's talk turkey. As in, what's the best way to thaw a frozen turkey? Ding, ding, ding. You got it. Thawing the turkey in a cooler will keep it safely out of the temperature danger zone. Let's find out some other ways to thaw food. Your mission is to keep TCS food out of the temperature danger zone when thawing it. If you don't, then pathogens can start to grow, and that can mean trouble. That's why you should never thaw food at room temperature. In fact, there are only 4 acceptable ways to thaw food in the operation. 1. In a cooler, keeping the food at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower. 2. In a microwave oven, if the food is then cooked immediately in conventional cooking equipment, like an oven or grill. 3. By thawing it in water in a cleaned and sanitized food prep sink, but only if you follow all the rules. Namely, you need to keep the food submerged under drinkable running water at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius or lower. And don't just dribble the water. Make sure the flow is strong enough to wash any loose bits of food down the drain. While you're doing this, you can never let the temperature of the food go above 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius for longer than 4 hours. And that 4 hours is the total time to thaw the food plus the time it takes to prep or cool it. 4. You can make your life easy and thaw food as part of the cooking process. Putting a frozen hamburger patty directly on the grill is an example of this. It doesn't get much simpler than that, right? Make sure your staff knows the 4 ways to thaw food.
There's one kind of food that has its own set of rules. Reduced oxygen packaged fish. Vacuum-packed fish is one example. Now, this kind of fish is usually kept frozen until it's ready for use. If this requirement is stated on the manufacturer's label, then the fish needs to be removed from the packaging before thawing it under refrigeration, or right before or right after thawing it under running water. Now, if your operation is the one doing the packaging, and you're using a reduced oxygen packaging method, the fish must be frozen before, during, or after packaging. It must also include a label that states that the fish should be frozen until used.
It's probably no surprise, but some food has specific rules about how it needs to be prepped in order to keep it safe. There's a pretty good chance that you already know a lot of this, but your staff may not. So it's up to you to know the rules and keep food safe. Okay, here's a question for you. Let's say you've got some whole watermelons and some cut watermelons. Which ones need to be refrigerated? Yes, you got it. Sliced melons, cut tomatoes, and cut leafy greens must be held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, or lower. Some operations also have staff hold other fresh-cut produce at these temperatures. Let's take a look at some other produce-specific requirements. When prepping produce, avoid cross-contamination by making sure that fruit and vegetables do not touch surfaces exposed to raw meat, seafood, or poultry. When you're washing produce, wash it thoroughly under running water. This is especially important before cutting, cooking, or combining the produce with other ingredients. You're going to want to use water that's a little warmer than the produce. And if you're washing leafy greens like lettuce or spinach, you want to remove the outer leaves and pull the rest of the product completely apart. Then rinse it thoroughly. Some managers like to use chemicals specifically for washing produce or even wash it in water containing ozone. Both of these can help reduce pathogens. Your local regulatory authority can tell you what's okay to use for this. Now let's get into something that's done a bit less frequently. If you're soaking or storing produce in standing water or ice water slurry like to keep celery crisp, do not mix different items or use the water for multiple batches of the same item. This can allow pathogens to transfer from one batch to the next. You don't want that. And finally, if you primarily serve high-risk populations, do not serve raw seed sprouts. Eggs. Lots of operations use them, and they also have their own set of rules when it comes to prepping them. Ever heard of the term pooled eggs? It basically means that you've taken a bunch of eggs and cracked them into the same container, like in the picture. If your local regulatory authority allows you to use pooled eggs, then there are some standards you need to stick to. First off, you want to either cook them immediately after mixing or store them at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower. And clean and sanitize the containers that you're using to hold the eggs before making a new batch. You might already know about pasteurized eggs. These are available in the shell and also in egg products like a carton of liquid eggs. And you should consider using them when you're prepping dishes that need little or no cooking. Examples include Caesar salad dressing, hollandaise sauce, tiramisu, and mousse.
Here's a question. Is it acceptable to serve a resident in a nursing home eggs over easy if you use pasteurized eggs? Yes, it is. If you primarily serve a high-risk population, such as a hospital or a nursing home, it is acceptable to serve raw or undercooked eggs as long as you make sure to use pasteurized eggs or egg products. Also, if you're going to pool eggs for these populations, then you need to use pasteurized eggs for that as well. Here's another one. If you're making a cake for the patients in a hospital, is it acceptable to use non-pasteurized shell eggs? Boom, that's right. If you primarily serve a high-risk population, it's okay to use non-pasteurized eggs and egg products as long as the food will be cooked all the way through. A fully cooked omelet or cake are examples. So, to sum it up, for high-risk populations, you need to use pasteurized eggs for undercooked products, but non-pasteurized eggs are fine for things that are fully cooked.
Salads that are made with TCS food, like tuna salad, require some extra attention during preparation. Chicken, tuna, egg, pasta, and potato salads have all been involved in foodborne illness outbreaks. You see, these salads aren't usually cooked after preparation, so you won't have a chance to reduce any pathogens that may have gotten into them. So there are some extra guidelines that need to be followed. Some operations use leftover TCS food in these salads, such as leftover pasta, chicken, or potatoes, and that's fine. But they can only be used if the food was cooked, held, and cooled correctly. Now, of course, the leftovers have to be held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower, and they can only be held for a maximum of 7 days. Therefore, it's important to check the use-by date on the leftovers before adding them to the salad. Time to talk about something a lot of people overlook: ice. Even though staff members may sometimes forget it, ice is food. Just like any other food, it needs to be handled correctly to prevent contamination and keep guests safe from foodborne illness. To make sure the ice is safe in your operation, the very first step is to make sure that the ice you use is made from water that is safe to drink. The next thing you need to do is ensure that staff know to never use ice as an ingredient if that ice was used to keep food cold. So, for example, don't take ice from the salad bar and put it in someone's drink. Who knows what could have gotten on that ice? The last thing you need to know is how to handle ice safely. Always use cleaned and sanitized containers and ice scoops when transferring ice from the ice machine to other containers. And be sure to store those ice scoops outside of the machine in a clean, protected location. Now, if you need to hold ice or carry it someplace, never use containers that have held chemicals. And make sure staff know to never touch ice with bare hands. Finally, never use a glass to scoop ice. You can probably guess why. Nobody wants to find shards of broken glass in their drink. Depending on the kinds of food prep activities that occur in your operation, you may need to get what's called a variance from your local regulatory authority. A variance is a document issued by the authority that allows a regulatory requirement to be waived or changed. And it may be issued if your operation is performing special processes that require extra oversight from the local regulatory authority. Maybe you're already familiar with variances. Let's see. If you want to grow and serve your own fresh sprouts in a restaurant, say alfalfa sprouts, do you need a variance? Yep, you sure do. Sprouting seeds or beans in the operation is one of the activities that require a variance. That's because the sprouting process is at an elevated risk for the growth of foodborne pathogens. Let's look at some more practices that require a variance. In addition to sprouting, you'll need to get a variance if your operation plans on doing a number of other things, including packaging unpasteurized fresh juice on site for sale at a later time. Now, if you put a warning label that complies with local regulations on that juice, then you can skip the variance. But if you want to smoke food as a means of preserving it, or if you want to cure food, then you need a variance. Happily, you don't need one if you're just smoking the food for flavor. When else do you need a variance? Well, if you're using food additives or adding other things like vinegar to preserve or alter the food so it no longer needs time or temperature control for safety, then a variance is required. Same thing if you want to offer live shellfish from a display tank. You also need to get a variance if you are using a reduced oxygen packaging or ROP method like modified atmosphere packaging, also called MAP, vacuum packing, or sous vide food. That's because Clostridium botulinum and Listeria monocytogenes are risks to food packed in these ways. And your local regulatory authority will review your processes and procedures to make sure you're doing it safely. And finally, you need a variance if you custom process animals for personal use. An example of this is a hunter bringing a deer to a restaurant to be dressed, and then the hunter takes the meat home for later use. It's not the most common thing, but some operations do this.
Now, when you're applying for a variance, your regulatory authority may also require you to submit a HACCP plan. If so, there are certain things that they'll expect. First, the plan must account for any food safety risks related to the way you plan to prep the food item. In addition, you must comply with the HACCP plan and procedures that you submit. Finally, you will have to maintain written records and provide them when requested by the regulatory authority. These records must show that you are regularly following procedures for monitoring critical control points and are actually monitoring them. They must also show that you are verifying the effectiveness of the operation or process and that you're taking the necessary corrective actions if there is a failure at a critical control point.
We can't talk about safe preparation without talking about cooking. Cooking food correctly is one of the tools you have to keep people safe from foodborne illness. That's because cooking reduces some of the pathogens that cause foodborne illness.
Cooking food can reduce pathogens to safe levels, but only if the food reaches the correct minimum internal temperature and stays there for a specific amount of time. In fact, cooking to the correct minimum internal temperature for the right amount of time is the only way to reduce pathogens to safe levels. But while cooking reduces pathogens, it can't destroy spores or toxins that are already in the food. So, handle it correctly before you cook it. To make sure that food has reached the correct temperature, you'll need to know how to take temperatures correctly. First, select a thermometer with a probe that's the right size for the food you want to temp. Then, stick the thermometer into the thickest part of the food, usually the center, and wait until the thermometer reading stays steady. And always take another reading in a different spot.
Time to practice temping. Drag the thermometer to the correct spot on the meat to check the temperature. Nicely done. You always want to check the temperature of food in the thickest spot. It's important to monitor the temperatures of cooked food to make sure it has reached the correct temperature. Different food needs to be cooked to different temperatures. Life would be easier if there was just one temperature to remember for everything, but unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Minimum temperatures have been developed for TCS food, so you need to know the different temperatures and share them with your staff. Now, some operations or jurisdictions may use different temperatures, but let's start with the basics.
All right, let's check out the cooking temperatures you need to know. Remember, we're talking about internal temperatures here, not surface temperatures. Poultry, including whole or ground chicken, turkey, or duck, should be cooked to 165 degrees Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Celsius. And you only have to hold that temperature for less than a second. That's pretty much instantaneous, right? Other food that should be cooked to this same temperature includes stuffing made with meat, fish, or poultry, and also stuffed pasta, meat, seafood, or poultry. And if you're making a dish that includes previously cooked TCS ingredients, like a casserole, then that dish should be cooked to 165 degrees Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Celsius for less than a second. However, the raw ingredients should be cooked to their minimum internal temperature. For ground meat, it's 155 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 degrees Celsius for 17 seconds. That includes beef, pork, and other meat. The same goes for mechanically tenderized meat and injected meat, including brined ham and flavor-injected roasts, ground, chopped, or minced seafood, and shell eggs that will be hot held for service. There are a couple of unusual items that you should probably know about, like ground meat from game animals that are commercially raised and inspected. Think buffalo burgers. And ratites, including emu and ostrich. They all have to be cooked to 155 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 degrees Celsius for 17 seconds. Who knew? Moving on. Seafood, including fish, shellfish, and crustaceans, has to be cooked to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, 63 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. And the same goes for steaks, or chops of pork, beef, veal, and lamb. 145 degrees Fahrenheit, 63 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds is also the cooking temperature for shell eggs that will be served immediately, and for commercially raised and inspected game meat. Now, if you're cooking pork, beef, veal, or lamb roasts, they should be held at 145 degrees Fahrenheit, 63 degrees Celsius for quite a bit longer, 4 minutes. And there are also alternate cooking times and temps for roasts. Basically, as the internal cooking temperature of the roast goes down, the amount of time required goes up. And finally, food from plants that will be hot held for service must reach a temperature of 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius. That applies to fruit, vegetables, grains, including rice and pasta, and legumes, including beans and refried beans. All right, that was a whole lot of numbers. Let's see how many you can remember.
Here we go. Drag each food item to the skillet that shows the correct minimum internal cooking temperature for that food. Hey, all right. Looks like you did remember those cooking temperatures. Nice job.
Time for something that's pretty straightforward. Microwave cooking. We all know from personal experience that microwaves cook a bit differently than conventional cooking equipment. So it's probably not surprising that they've got their own set of rules.
If you cook meat, seafood, poultry, or eggs in the microwave, you need to make sure it reaches 165 degrees Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Celsius. So get your handy-dandy thermometers ready, then follow these steps. First, cover the food to prevent its surface from drying out. Easy. While cooking, always rotate or stir the food halfway through the process so the heat reaches the food more evenly. After cooking, let the covered food stand for at least 2 minutes so the temperature evens out. And finally, pull out those thermometers and then check the temperature of the food in at least 2 places to make sure it's cooked through. Congrats! You've mastered the microwave.
Some operations partially cook food during prep and then finish it off right before service. This is called partial cooking or par cooking. If you're going to do this with meat, seafood, poultry, eggs, or with any dishes that contain these things, then there are some steps to follow. Partial cooking is a 5-step process. The first step is pretty obvious. Start cooking. Just make sure that you don't cook the food for more than 60 minutes during initial cooking. When you're done with the initial cooking, then get it cooled down correctly. Do this immediately after cooking. Once you've cooled the food down, go ahead and freeze or refrigerate it. If you're going to refrigerate it, make sure it's held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, or lower, and store it away from ready-to-eat food. Then when you're ready, just heat the food to its required minimum internal temperature before selling or serving it. If you aren't going to hot hold or serve that fully heated food right away, then cool it down for storage. And that's all there is to it. If you partially cook food at your operation, your local regulatory authority will require you to have a written procedure. They're going to want something that explains how partially cooked food will be prepped and stored. The procedures will have to be approved by the authority, and they should include a description of how any requirements will be monitored and documented. They should also describe which corrective actions will be taken if the requirements aren't met. Plus, you'll need to note how the par-cooked food items will be marked after initial cooking to show that they still need further cooking. Finally, the documentation should cover how the par-cooked items will be separated from ready-to-eat food during storage after the initial cooking has been completed. We talk a lot about cooking TCS food to the correct internal temperature, and we need to make sure those temperatures are met. But what about cases where a guest wants something else, like a rare steak?
If your menu includes TCS items that are raw or undercooked, then you need to note it on your menu next to the item. This is especially true for meat, eggs, and seafood. An easy way you can do this is to put an asterisk next to the item that directs the guest to a footnote at the bottom of the menu. The footnote needs to include a statement that the item is raw or undercooked, or contains raw or undercooked ingredients. This is called disclosure. You also have a responsibility to remind guests who order raw or undercooked food that this carries an increased risk of foodborne illness. You can do this by posting a notice in your menu, or you can put this information out on brochures, table tents, signs, or through other written methods. Now here's something that you really need to know about raw or undercooked food. The Food and Drug Administration advises against offering raw or undercooked meat, poultry, seafood, or eggs on kids' menus. And this is especially true for undercooked ground beef. That's because it can be contaminated with sugar toxin-producing E. coli 0157H7. Most people just call it E. coli, and it's bad news. So, no rare burgers for the kids.
I've got a question about high-risk populations. If you primarily serve a high-risk population, like in a nursing home, is it okay to serve a rare hamburger? You're exactly right. If you're primarily serving a high-risk population, like in a nursing home or a daycare, you should never serve certain items including raw or undercooked eggs, meat, or seafood. And these operations shouldn't serve raw seed sprouts or unpasteurized milk or juice either. So for these operations, rare hamburgers, over-easy eggs, and raw oysters on the half shell are not on the menu. If cooked food won't be served immediately, then we need it to get out of the temperature danger zone by cooling it as quickly as possible. Yeah, of course there's a procedure for this, and there's also a procedure for reheating it safely too. Cooling food is a 2-step process, so what's the first step? Nice job. Now let's review the whole cooling process. Pathogens grow well in the temperature danger zone, but they grow really fast at temperatures between 125 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 52 degrees Celsius, and 21 degrees Celsius. So, food must pass through this temperature range quickly. If food isn't cooled correctly, any pathogens left on it can grow and make people sick. Nobody wants that. So, first, you have to cool food from 135 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius to 21 degrees Celsius. And you have to do it within 2 hours. Then you need to cool the food to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower in the next 4 hours. That's a total cooling time of 6 hours. What should you do if the food hasn't reached 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius within the first 2 hours? Reheat it and cool it again. Oh, and if you can get the food from 135 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius to 21 degrees Celsius in less than 2 hours, you can use the remaining time to get it to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, or lower. Just remember that the total cooling time still can't be longer than 6 hours.
Let's talk about the things that can affect how fast food can cool. Here we've got 1 container of refried beans and 1 container of chicken broth. Which one do you think will cool off faster? Absolutely right. You may already know that the thickness or density of the food affects cooling. The thicker the food, the slower it cools. And the refried beans are much thicker than the chicken broth. Next one. Which do you think will cool off faster? Yep. One of the things that affects how fast items cool is the size of the item. Large food items cool more slowly than smaller ones. So, to let food cool faster, you want to reduce its size by cutting larger items into smaller pieces and divide large containers of food into smaller containers or shallow pans. Last one. Here we've got a plastic container of mashed potatoes on one side and a stainless steel pan of mashed potatoes on the other. Which one do you think will cool off faster? You got it. Stainless steel transfers heat away from food faster than plastic. Also, it's good that the food is in a shallow pan, which lets the heat disperse faster than a deep pan would.
The goal when cooling food is to move it out of the temperature danger zone as quickly as possible. That way pathogens don't have a chance to grow to dangerous levels. Here are some of the steps you can take to make sure food is cooled quickly and safely. When cooling food, there are some things you want to avoid. Don't try to cool a large amount of food in the cooler. Most coolers aren't designed to cool a large amount of hot food quickly. Plus, just putting it in the cooler may not allow the food to cool quickly enough. Don't worry though, there are plenty of other ways we can cool food. Once you've divided your food into smaller containers, cool it by putting it in an ice water bath, which is just a large pot or a clean prep sink full of ice water. Stirring the food frequently will help it cool even faster and more evenly. Another option is to stir the food with an ice paddle, which is a plastic paddle that can be filled with ice or water and then frozen. Stirring food with an ice paddle will cool it quickly, and stirring food with an ice paddle while it's in an ice water bath will cool it even faster. If you're trying to cool something like soup or stew, then there's another option, adding cold water or ice right to the product after cooking. If you do this, just make sure you plan ahead and make the dish with less water. When the added ice melts, it will make up the difference and provide needed water. And finally, if your operation has one, you can use a blast chiller. This piece of equipment is made to cool large amounts of food quickly by blasting cold air across it to remove heat. If food is stored for further cooling, make sure to loosely cover it. Now, food can be left uncovered during the cooling process, but only if you make sure that you store it in a way that prevents contaminants from getting into it. Store uncovered containers above other food, especially raw meat, seafood, and poultry, to prevent cross-contamination. You don't want that stuff dripping or falling into an uncovered container. Keep in mind that the food should be covered when it's done cooling. Hey, we're just about done with preparation. Only one thing left: reheating. Quick question. To what temperature do you need to reheat beef for a beef sandwich? That's right. Now do you know why? Let's explore this a bit further. How you reheat food depends on how you intend to use it. As long as it was cooked and cooled correctly in the first place, then food that's reheated and served immediately for an individual portion, like roast beef for a hot sandwich, can be reheated to any temperature. Nice, right? But if you're reheating TCS food and holding it for later service, like with soup, it must be heated to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. The food must reach this temperature within 2 hours. This is true no matter what method you use to reheat the food, including microwave ovens. Some commercially processed and packaged ready-to-eat food must also be reheated before serving. Fried vegetables, pre-cooked chicken wings, and deep-fried cheese sticks are examples. This kind of food must be reheated to an internal temperature of at least 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius. Nice work. Just answer a few questions about preparation and you're all done with this module.
What should you do if you find that food has been contaminated with fluid that dripped out of a food handler's nose? That's exactly right. If food has become contaminated by hands or by bodily fluids from the nose or mouth, the corrective action to take is simple: throw it out. Which item must be held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower? That's right. Sliced melons, cut leafy greens, and cut tomatoes all must be held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius or lower. To check the temperature of food, where should you place the thermometer? Yes, right. To check the temperature of food, you should insert your thermometer into the thickest part.
What is the required minimum internal cooking temperature for ground beef? That's it! Ground meat, including ground beef, must be cooked to 155 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 degrees Celsius.
When cooling TCS food, how long do you have to get the temperature from 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius, to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius? Correct. The first step in cooling is to reduce the temperature from 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius, to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius, in 2 hours or less. You need to reheat food that will be hot held for later service. To what temperature do you need to reheat it? Absolutely. If you're reheating food that will be hot held, then you need to heat it up to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. Nice job.